In November 1896, hundreds of Sacramento residents looked up and saw something that shouldn't have existed. A massive cigar-shaped vessel glided across the night sky, its searchlight sweeping the ground below. Witnesses heard voices from above, men laughing and talking as if they were steering a ship through water instead of air. One voice carried down clearly, "We ought to get to San Francisco by tomorrow afternoon." The problem: powered flight wouldn't be invented for another 7 years. The Wright brothers were still running their bicycle shop. Yet thousands of Americans were watching enormous airships cruise through their skies at speeds that would remain impossible for decades. This wasn't folklore. These were newspaper reports, official accounts, testimonies from law enforcement and city officials. The sighting spread like wildfire from California to the Midwest. By April 1897, 10,000 people in Kansas City claimed they'd witnessed a huge aerial machine pass overhead. The descriptions matched across hundreds of miles. Vessels measuring 150 to 200 feet long, bright metallic hulls, wing-like structures extending from the sides, powerful electric searchlights that could illuminate entire city blocks, and speeds of 135 to 150 miles per hour, when the most advanced experimental airships of the era could barely manage 7. The official explanation came quickly: mass hysteria, yellow journalism inventing stories to sell newspapers, misidentified Venus or weather balloons. Simple frontier folk embellishing what they'd seen. But that explanation requires ignoring something crucial. Real inventors were filing real patents for airship designs during these exact years. Charles Abbott Smith in San Francisco had attracted serious investment capital for his airship plans. Solomon Andrews had flown a functional airship in New Jersey back in 1863. Frederick Marriott had demonstrated his Aviator Hermes Jr. in California in 1869. These weren't dreamers. They were engineers working with actual materials, actual designs, actual mathematics. What if the mystery airships weren't mysteries at all? What if someone had simply gotten there first, and everything that followed was an elaborate effort to make sure we forgot? The technical specifications witnesses reported sound impossible, until you examine what Victorian engineers actually knew. In 1783, more than a century before the mystery airship wave, Lieutenant Jean-Baptiste Marie Meusnier presented detailed plans to the French Academy for a 260-foot streamlined envelope with internal ballonets for regulating lift. His designs included 3 propellers and a sail-like rudder. He'd worked out the mathematics of controlled lighter-than-air flight before the United States existed as a nation. By the 1850s, Henry Giffard had already achieved engine-powered flight, traveling 17 miles in a steam-powered airship. Jean-Pierre Blanchard had crossed the English Channel in a balloon equipped with propulsion systems back in 1785. The technology existed. The theoretical knowledge was documented. Patents were filed. Investors were interested. So why does history insist that nothing flew until 1903? The materials tell a different story. Victorian airship proposals detailed gas bags made from silk, rubberized canvas, oiled cloth, hollow steel, and aluminum. Hydrogen production was well understood and readily accessible. Structural frameworks ranged from rigid metal designs to pressure-maintained envelopes. Steam power, compressed air, electric batteries. All of it was available. All of it was being actively developed. One inventor from Mount Carmel, Illinois, even proposed using decomposition gases from dead birds, which he called buzzard gas. The point isn't that every design succeeded. The point is that serious engineers with serious resources were solving real problems with real solutions. Then came the sightings. Not scattered reports from unreliable witnesses, but consistent descriptions from prominent citizens, law enforcement officials, and professionals whose reputations depended on accuracy. The Quincy Morning Whig reported on April 11, 1897, men who saw the thing describe it as a long, slender body shaped like a cigar and made of some bright metal. On either side of the hull, extending outwards and upwards, were what appeared to be wings. At the front end was a headlight similar to the searchlights used on steamboats. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. This was technical description. The kind you'd give if you were trying to document something you'd actually witnessed. Some witnesses reported hearing conversations from the crews above. Not screams or shouts, but casual dialogue. Normal men discussing navigation, commenting on the weather, making plans for their next destination. They weren't performing for audiences below. They were simply going about their work, apparently unconcerned that thousands of people could see them doing something history claims was impossible. The skeptics pointed to yellow journalism, and they weren't entirely wrong. Newspapers in the 1890s absolutely fabricated stories to boost circulation. The Aurora, Texas incident where an airship supposedly crashed and its alien pilot received a Christian burial. Pure invention. The San Francisco Chronicle called the whole phenomenon probably one of the greatest hoaxes ever sprung on any community. But then they added something interesting. It is hard to account for the evident sincerity of those who claim they saw the machine and heard the voices. That's the crack in the official narrative. Even the skeptics couldn't fully dismiss what witnesses were reporting, because too many credible people were reporting the same thing. Thousands of independent observations across multiple states over several months. Detailed technical descriptions that matched despite geographic separation. Physical characteristics that aligned with actual engineering principles being developed during the same period. Victorian society understood what airships meant for the future. Writers predicted that within decades, farmers would hitch loads to their airboats and lift clear of trees to head straight to market. Cities would become obsolete because airships could make any rural location as accessible as an urban center. Land used for highways would return to agriculture. The entire structure of civilization would transform once humans mastered the sky. This wasn't science fiction to them. This was practical forecasting based on technological trajectories they could observe accelerating around them. But something changed after 1897. The sightings stopped. Not gradually, abruptly. The newspaper reports dried up. The inventors who'd been seeking funding went quiet. Patents that had been filed with optimism seemed to lead nowhere. And when Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin finally launched his first successful rigid airship in 1900, history treated it as the beginning of airship development rather than the continuation of work that had been progressing for decades. What happened between 1897 and 1900? Why did a technology that thousands had witnessed suddenly require reinvention? The official story says the mystery airships never existed, that mass delusion and journalistic fraud explained everything. But that story requires ignoring the engineering reality of Victorian capabilities. It requires dismissing thousands of consistent witness accounts. It requires pretending that documented inventors with documented patents and documented demonstrations had achieved nothing. And it requires us to ignore the most disturbing possibility of all, that what appeared over America in 1896 wasn't prototype testing or experimental flights, that it was retrieval operations, someone collecting technology that had been here all along. Look at what inventors were actually achieving before the blackout. Solomon Andrews flew his Ariane in New Jersey in 1863, 33 years before the mystery airship wave. His craft used a system of shifting ballonets to control altitude without dropping ballast or venting gas. That's sophisticated aeronautical engineering during the Civil War. Frederick Marriott demonstrated his Avatar Hermes Jr. in California in 1869, a steam-powered airship that actually flew, witnessed by credible observers, documented in newspapers. 27 years before the supposed beginning of the mystery. These weren't fantasies. These were functional aircraft with documented test flights and verified witnesses. Yet somehow history treats them as footnotes, curiosities that led nowhere. But here's what doesn't add up. If Andrews successfully flew in 1863, why wasn't his design immediately developed further? If Marriott proved steam propulsion worked in 1869, why did airship development supposedly stall for 3 decades? The technology existed. The principles were proven. The engineering was sound. Unless the development didn't stall, unless it continued in ways that weren't being publicly documented. Charles Abbott Smith filed detailed patents for airship designs in San Francisco during the 1890s. The patents still exist. The technical drawings show remarkable sophistication. Smith garnered serious attention from investors, the kind of financial backing that suggests people believed his designs would work. Then the mystery airships appear over California and suddenly Smith's project goes quiet. No announcements of successful flights, no public demonstrations, no further patent applications, just silence. Did his funding dry up? Did his designs fail? Or did someone decide his work needed to continue without public scrutiny? The engineering knowledge required for the reported airships shouldn't have existed in 1896. Witnesses described craft 150 to 200 feet long traveling at speeds of 135 to 150 miles per hour. Contemporary airships, the ones officially recognized, moved at 5 to 7 miles per hour. That's not incremental improvement. That's a completely different level of propulsion technology, structural engineering, and aerodynamic understanding. To achieve those speeds, you need lightweight engines with extraordinary power-to-weight ratios. You need hull designs that minimize drag. You need control surfaces that remain stable at high velocity. None of that supposedly existed in 1896. But what if it did exist, just not where we've been told to look? Lieutenant Jean-Baptiste Marie Meusnier presented detailed airship designs to the French Academy in 1783. His drawings depicted a 260-foot streamlined envelope with internal ballonets for altitude control, 3 propellers for propulsion, and a rudder for steering. The design included a long carriage that could function as a boat if forced to land on water. This wasn't speculation. This was engineering documentation more than a century before the mystery airship wave. Meusnier understood principles that wouldn't supposedly be rediscovered until the early 1900s. Why didn't anyone build his design? The official answer is lack of suitable engines. The unofficial answer might be that someone did build it, just not for public record. Victorian inventors weren't limited by imagination. They were limited by materials and power sources. Gas bags could be constructed from silk, rubberized canvas, or oiled cloth. Structural frames could use hollow steel or aluminum. Hydrogen production was well understood chemistry by the 1850s. The only missing piece was propulsion. Steam engines were too heavy, human power too weak, electric batteries too primitive, except dozens of inventors claim to have solved exactly that problem. Patents exist for compressed air systems, hybrid power arrangements, and engine designs that supposedly were never built. Why file a patent for something you never constructed? Why go through the legal expense and technical documentation if your invention existed only on paper? Unless those inventions did get built, and the patents were filed to establish legal ownership before the devices were deployed in ways the public wasn't meant to know about. Think about the timing. The mystery airships appear in late 1896. They're seen by thousands, described consistently. photographed occasionally, though those images conveniently disappeared from archives. Then in 1897, the sightings intensify. April 1st, up to 10,000 people observe an aerial machine over Kansas City. That's not mass hallucination. That's not hoax. That's an event witnessed by enough people that dismissing it requires ignoring an enormous body of testimony. But after April 1897, everything stops. The sightings end. The newspaper coverage ceases. The inventors who'd been seeking funding go quiet. What changed? One possibility is that whatever operation was happening concluded. The craft were collected, hidden, or destroyed. Another possibility is that someone decided public awareness had become too widespread, too detailed, too dangerous. The technology needed to vanish back into secrecy. And the most effective way to hide something isn't to destroy all evidence. It's to make the evidence seem ridiculous. Let enough time pass. Allow enough debunking. Create enough doubt. Eventually, the truth becomes indistinguishable from fiction. By 1900, when Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin launched his first rigid airship, history was ready to accept a new narrative. Zeppelin became the father of the airship, despite the fact that he'd been developing his design since 1874, inspired by Union Army observation balloons he'd seen during the American Civil War. His diary entry from March 1874 describes large, rigidly framed envelopes containing separate gas bags. He completed detailed designs by 1893, received his patent in 1895, the same period when mystery airships were flying over America. Was Zeppelin inventing airship technology or refining it? Was he the pioneer or the public face of development that had been happening elsewhere? The Victorian vision of airship transformed society wasn't fantasy. They genuinely believed aerial navigation would eliminate the need for roads, decentralize cities, and revolutionize agriculture. Farmers hitching loads to airboats and lifting clear of trees to head straight to market. Rural locations becoming as accessible as urban centers. Highways returning to farmland because transportation no longer required ground infrastructure. This wasn't science fiction to them. This was practical forecasting based on technological trajectories they could observe. They saw where airship development was heading because they were watching it happen in real time. Then someone decided the public couldn't see it anymore. What if the mystery airships weren't the beginning of aviation technology? What if they were the end of public awareness? The moment when development that had been gradually accelerating suddenly went dark, continued in facilities we don't know about, by organizations whose records don't appear in conventional archives. The technology didn't disappear. It just stopped being visible, and that raises one question nobody seems willing to ask. If airships capable of 135 miles per hour existed in 1896, what else existed that we're not being told about? The answer might be hiding in something nobody thinks to question anymore. Municipal water systems. Every major city in America underwent massive infrastructure overhauls between 1870 and 1910. Miles of underground tunnels, enormous pumping stations, reservoir systems that required moving millions of gallons against gravity. The official story credits steam power and industrial revolution engineering. But when you examine the scale of what was built, when you look at the lifting capacity required, the mathematics start breaking down. Steam engines of that era could barely move locomotives efficiently. Yet somehow they were powering systems that lifted entire city water, supplies hundreds of feet vertically through distribution networks spanning dozens of miles. The energy requirements don't match the available technology. Unless something else was doing the heavy lifting. Literally. Here's what makes this suspicious. The same decades when mystery airships vanished, municipal engineering projects exploded across America. Not gradually. Suddenly. Cities that had struggled with basic sanitation for generations abruptly constructed elaborate underground systems with engineering precision that wouldn't be matched again until the mid-1900s. Philadelphia's water system expansion in 1897. Chicago's sanitary district projects throughout the 1890s. New York's reservoir network reaching completion just after the turn of the century. All of them required moving massive volumes of water against gravity using technology that officially wasn't capable of the task. But if you had access to lifting technology developed from airship research, technology capable of moving 150-foot craft at 135 miles per hour, adapting that same propulsion and lift principle to stationary pumping systems, becomes straightforward engineering. You're not inventing new physics. You're repurposing existing capability for a different application. The airships didn't disappear. They got installed underground where nobody would see them operate. Think about the timeline. Mystery airships peak in early 1897. By late 1897, they're gone. But 1897 through 1905 represents the most aggressive period of municipal infrastructure construction in American history. Projects that had been proposed for decades suddenly received funding and completion timelines that seemed impossible. Chicago's reversal of the river flow, completed in 1900, required moving water on a scale that contemporary engineers said couldn't be done with available steam technology. They did it anyway. Philadelphia's Fairmount Water Works expansion involved lifting capacity that exceeded anything documented in industrial records, completed ahead of schedule. The official records show steam pumps, large steam pumps, expensive steam pumps that consumed coal at rates that should have bankrupted city budgets. Except when you trace the coal consumption records, they don't match the output. The amount of coal purchased and burned doesn't generate enough energy to explain the water volumes being moved. There's a gap. A significant gap between fuel input and hydraulic output that conventional thermodynamics can't explain. Something else was contributing energy to these systems that isn't appearing in the official documentation. I started pulling municipal engineering reports from the 1890s, not the public summaries. The actual maintenance logs and operational records filed by site supervisors. And buried in those documents, you find references to sealed chambers, restricted access areas within pumping stations where only specific personnel were allowed, ventilation requirements that far exceeded what steam boilers needed, and periodic inspections by federal representatives with no clear departmental affiliation. These weren't normal operational procedures for municipal water systems. These were security protocols. One report from a Philadelphia pumping station in 1899 mentions a lower mechanical chamber requiring specialized maintenance performed by technicians brought in from Washington. The city engineers weren't allowed access. Their own facility had sections they couldn't enter. The report notes unusual vibration patterns and describes the sealed chamber as producing a steady hum, inconsistent with steam equipment which operates in rhythmic pulses as pistons fire and valves open. Whatever was down, they ran continuously with a constant output that steam technology couldn't achieve. Another document from Chicago's sanitary district references contractual obligations to maintain confidentiality regarding certain mechanical installations. City workers signed agreements preventing them from discussing specific equipment configurations. For a water pumping station, why would municipal water infrastructure require non-disclosure agreements unless the technology being used wasn't supposed to be publicly known? The pieces connect when you stop treating the airships and the infrastructure as separate stories. They're the same story. The airships were the proof of concept, the visible demonstration that lift technology had advanced beyond public understanding. But once that technology proved viable, It had applications far more valuable than transportation. It could move water. It could power industrial systems. It could drive machinery at scales that would transform manufacturing and urban development. And all of it could happen underground, out of sight, with steam power taking credit for output it couldn't actually produce. This explains why the airship sighting stopped so abruptly. The technology didn't fail. It succeeded. It succeeded so completely that keeping it visible became a liability. Better to let it fade from memory. Let people assume it was hoax or exaggeration, while the actual devices got installed in locations where they'd never be photographed or documented in ways the public could access. The mystery airships weren't the end of anything. They were field tests, and once testing concluded successfully, deployment began in earnest. By 1900, every major American city had infrastructure that officially ran on steam but operationally required something more. The pump houses were larger than necessary. The underground chambers extended deeper than steam equipment needed, and the operational costs, when you account for actual coal consumption, don't explain the work being performed. There's missing energy in every calculation, energy that had to come from somewhere. You can still see evidence of this if you know where to look. Old pumping stations that are now historic landmarks. Tour guides mention the impressive steam engines on display. But if you examine the buildings carefully, you'll notice sealed passages leading to lower levels that aren't part of the tour. Ventilation shafts that descend far below the basement where steam equipment sits. Structural reinforcement in floor systems that suggests something heavy was installed beneath the visible machinery, something that needed support beyond what 19th-century steam pumps required. The buildings remember what they housed, even if the official history doesn't acknowledge it. And that's the pattern repeating again. Visible technology taking credit for output generated by invisible systems. Public narratives that explain just enough to satisfy casual questions, while the actual mechanisms remain hidden in restricted spaces that nobody thinks to examine. The airships flew for barely 6 months in public view, but the infrastructure they enabled has been operating for more than a century, still lifting water, still moving mass, still functioning with efficiency that the official technology can't fully account for. We inherited a system we didn't build, powered by principles we're not supposed to understand. And every time someone notices the inconsistencies, the response is the same. Steam power, industrial revolution, normal engineering. Move along, nothing unusual here. Except the mathematics don't work. The energy doesn't balance. And the sealed chambers under every major city suggest something far more sophisticated was installed than anyone wants to admit. The question nobody asks is what happened to the inventors. The newspapers mention them constantly during the airship wave. Men with names, sometimes with addresses, claiming they'd perfected aerial navigation. Charles Abbott Smith in San Francisco drew investor attention with his patented design. Others filed similar patents throughout 1896 and early 1897. Then the sighting stopped, and so did the inventors. No triumphant announcements, no public demonstrations, no commercial airship services launching in 1898 or 1899. Just silence. If the technology failed, you'd expect bankruptcy notices, failed investor lawsuits, public embarrassment. If it succeeded, you'd expect the opposite. Patents being exercised, companies forming, competitors emerging. Instead, nothing. The inventors vanished from public record as completely as the airships vanished from the sky. That's not how technological development works unless someone made it worth their while to stop talking. Consider the timeline carefully. The airship sightings peak in spring 1897. By summer, they've stopped. By 1898, new urban infrastructure projects are underway in cities that reported the most sightings. Philadelphia, Chicago, Kansas City, San Francisco, all launching ambitious water system upgrades, all featuring pump houses with architectural elements that don't match standard steam facilities. The timing suggests the field tests concluded successfully, and implementation began immediately. What would you offer an inventor to secure exclusive rights to technology that could transform urban infrastructure? Not just money, protection, resources, access to manufacturing facilities that could produce components without public scrutiny, and most importantly, silence, because the value of lift technology wasn't in selling airships to the public. It was in controlling the infrastructure that every growing city desperately needed. Water systems were just the beginning. Sewage management, industrial waste removal, mining operations, any application where you needed to move heavy materials vertically. Steam power could pull horizontally with impressive force, but vertical lift remained problematic. Pumps were inefficient. Elevators were limited. But if you could generate directed lift, if you could make heavy objects effectively weightless within a controlled system, the applications became endless. Look at mining operations from 1900 onwards. Shaft depths increased dramatically. Official explanations credit improved ventilation and more powerful steam pumps. But the debris removal rates don't match steam technology capabilities. Thousands of tons of rock coming up from depths exceeding 1,000 feet, moved with efficiency that the equipment on site couldn't achieve. Something was assisting the lift, reducing the actual weight being moved, making the visible machinery appear more capable than it was. The same pattern appears in construction. By 1905, buildings are rising higher than ever before. Steel frame construction gets the credit, and steel frames certainly mattered. But the speed of construction, the ease with which massive beams were positioned at height, the reduction in worker injuries from falling materials, all of it suggests the steel wasn't as heavy as it should have been during installation. Not permanently, just temporarily, just long enough to position it safely. You can dismiss one industry as improved technique, two industries as coincidental advancement. But when mining, construction, water management, and industrial manufacturing all show the same pattern of inexplicable efficiency improvement in the same narrow time frame, you're looking at technology deployment, not random innovation. The airships themselves were never meant for passenger service. That's why they disappeared so quickly. They were proof of principle. Demonstrations that lift technology worked at scale, that it could be controlled, that it could be safely operated by trained personnel. Once that was proven, the technology went where it was always intended to go: underground, inside buildings, integrated into infrastructure where it would never be photographed, never be casually observed, never generate the kind of public curiosity that flying machines naturally attracted. This explains something else that's puzzled researchers. Why did legitimate inventors like Solomon Andrews, who successfully flew his Ariane in 1863, fail to capitalize on proven technology? Andrews demonstrated controlled flight decades before the mystery airship wave. His design worked. He sought funding to develop it commercially. He never succeeded. Not because the technology was flawed, but because someone understood its real value lay elsewhere, in applications Andrews wasn't considering and wouldn't be allowed to pursue. The infrastructure we inherited from that era still functions today in ways that seem unremarkable because we've never questioned the baseline. Water systems move millions of gallons daily with pump efficiency that shouldn't be possible given the equipment's age and design. Historic mining operations extracted material from depths that should have been economically prohibitive. Buildings from 1900 to 1920 were constructed with speed that modern projects, despite superior technology, struggle to match. We've been taught to credit this to American industrial ingenuity, to the golden age of engineering, to the brilliance of Victorian-era innovation. And those elements certainly existed, but they don't fully explain the output. There's missing capacity in every equation, energy that had to come from somewhere, lift that exceeded what the visible machinery could generate. The sealed chambers under old pump houses aren't empty. They're not just abandoned basements or unused storage. In cities where access can be gained, where old municipal buildings haven't been completely renovated, you find spaces that show signs of equipment installation. Anchor points in floors and ceilings. Ventilation systems that connect to upper levels but serve no apparent purpose. Electrical conduits that predate the building's official electrification dates, all suggesting something was installed, something that needed power, cooling, and structural support beyond what steam pumps required. What's most telling is how these spaces are treated today, not as historical curiosities worth preserving or studying, as inconveniences, sealed off during renovations, filled with concrete when new foundations are poured, deliberately made inaccessible in ways that ensure whatever evidence remains will never be systematically examined. The pattern repeats across cities with remarkable consistency. Acknowledge the space exists, then make certain nobody can explore it properly. This is how advanced technology gets hidden in plain sight. Not through elaborate conspiracy, but through institutional inertia and convenient forgetting. The people who installed the systems knew what they were doing. The next generation knew something was there, but not what it did. The generation after that simply maintained the infrastructure without understanding its full capability. And we've reached a point where the technology is so integrated, so fundamental to how things work, that removing it would reveal its absence immediately. The mystery airships weren't mysterious at all. They were the last moment when this technology was visible, when people could see it operating in the open, when the public could witness something that shouldn't exist according to accepted science. That visibility was the mistake. One quickly corrected by moving everything underground, into restricted spaces, behind locked doors in facilities where asking questions wasn't encouraged. We live in cities that float slightly, though we'll never feel it. We use water systems that defy their own mechanical limitations. We occupy buildings that rose faster than they should have. And we accept it all because the alternative means acknowledging we don't understand the infrastructure we depend on. That Victorian engineers knew something we've forgotten. That technology more sophisticated than steam power was deployed over a century ago, and we've been pretending it was never there at all. The evidence sits in archived newspapers nobody reads, in patent files nobody examines, in sealed chambers nobody opens. Thousands saw the airships. Hundreds described them in technical detail. Dozens of inventors claimed success with designs that officially never flew. Then it all stopped, not because the technology failed, but because it succeeded too well to remain visible. Victorian engineers understood principles we've been taught didn't exist yet. They built infrastructure that still functions with impossible efficiency. They deployed systems we inherited without comprehension. And when the mathematics don't work, when the energy doesn't balance, when buildings that shouldn't exist keep standing, we credit steam power and move on. But the sealed chambers remember. The operational records show gaps we're not supposed to notice. And somewhere beneath every major city built between 1870 and 1920, equipment still operates that nobody admits was installed. The airships didn't vanish. They just stopped flying where we could see them. And everything that came after, every pump house, every deep mine, every impossibly fast construction project, carries the same signature. Technology that works better than it should, powered by principles we're told we only recently discovered. The mystery was never what flew over Sacramento in 1896. The mystery is what's still running underneath us, lifting water that steam couldn't move, supporting weight that steel alone can't hold, functioning perfectly while we pretend it was never there at all.